Last but hopefully not least, and hopefully we'll see you all back here again next year, we have Sarah Jeong and Emily Gorcenski. Sarah is a writer with The Verge, and Emily is a data scientist and engineer, and they're going to come up and present together. Over to you two.
Let's move these closer.
Yeah, let's.
Yeah.
All right.
Let me get my water, actually. I'm going to get thirsty. So Emily and I were not supposed to give this talk together. We met last night, and we were like, actually, we both kind of feel like we can't even get into the meat of what we're talking about in 20 minutes. And also, she was talking about fake science. I'm talking about fake news. We should just talk to each other. So that's what we're doing today.
Yeah, and I think it is very much in the spirit of MozFest to sort of mix things up, and you know, we're bringing the dialogue into the dialogue panels, and so yeah, I guess what is the sort of distilled essence of what you
of what my
wanted
talk
to
was
talk
going to
about?
be?
Yeah.
Well, I was going to, so with fake news, I'm sure with like the bajillion fake news panels that everyone has been attending, it's a very difficult definition. Like, there isn't really a definition. It's a bit like seeing like a grouping that's like A, B, B, C, C, D, and D, E, right? Where it's like, there's no relationship between A, B, and D, E, but it all belongs in sort of the same thing. And I wanted to do some disambiguation, talk around kind of a lot of the hysteria around Russian interference and what that actually means for fake news as a concept, because it's very hard to pin down literal falsity with incidents where we can confirm foreign interference, and kind of trace back all of these incidents to actually the advertising model that the internet currently runs on, and sort of the hegemony that Facebook has on our information ecosystem. It is creating some really perverse incentives. And you were going to talk about?
Yeah, so I was going to talk about fake science, and this is maybe not as prevalent a problem as fake news, but it sort of underscores a lot of what empowers fake news, and that is the ability to aid legitimacy or to make a story seem legitimate when it's not. And sort of originally I was planning, when I normally give this talk, it's 40 minutes long, and I go through a case study of one incident. And so there's no way that I could add in all of the new content and then also cut it down to 20 minutes. But there's sort of a very interesting case that happened last year with OkCupid, where a bunch of users had their information exposed by somebody who was trying to do, he was passing it off as scientific research, and it wasn't. It was really a thinly veiled attempt at sexism and white supremacy. And his goal was to try to shift the narrative around politics, around, in particular, Muslim immigration in Denmark. And he used this, you know, he was a very intellectually capable person, a very good computer programmer and statistician, but used that to generate fake stories through the scientific, you know, a corruption of the scientific method.
Can you speak more specifically to exactly what he did with the data and how he propagated it and what the effects were?
Yeah, sure. So what's interesting about it is there's a platform out there. There's actually let me kind of roll it back a little bit. There's a problem in the field of psychology right now called the replicability crisis. And what that is a lot of these psychology studies that are really well known, things like the power pose study, turn out to be irreproducible. And psychology studies are really hard to get good data in to begin with. And so when researchers have found like that these 30-year-old studies are not reproducible, an organization formed called the Center for Open Science. And they have built a framework that allows data sharing and preprint services, particularly for psychology. And so what he actually did was scraped a bunch of OkCupid user data and then dumped it on the open science framework. And in the process of doing so, not only did he like completely corrupt the scientific process, but he also, failed to anonymize it. So he doxed like 70,000 users. He, did this. He published this paper in a journal that he created and was the editor of, and didn't do this. He listed his university, but there was no IRB, and so there's, all of these problems that kind of came down. But what was interesting about it is, well, two things were interesting to me about it. One is that the Center for Open Science is headquartered in my home city of Charlottesville, which has been in the news, but also that in order to debunk what he's done, you need to be a very good statistician to realize that what he's doing was fake.
I think that sort of what's interesting with what you're, and I'm assuming there was a lot of harassment that came in the wake of all of this, and it sounds like, what was exactly sort of his paper? What was his conclusion?
Yeah, so his conclusion was he really, really, really reached to try to draw a correlation, a negative correlation between religiosity and intelligence.
Oh.
So through ridiculously advanced statistics and a horribly biased data set, because like OkCupid users, like 70,000 OkCupid users is not really representative of like the general population, managed to like draw this connection or claim that he drew this connection. And of course the headline wasn't, racist jerk comes up with false correlation. The headline was like, researcher finds correlation between religiousness and intelligence. And like it was literally fake news generated from the ground up.
Yeah, and so this is actually sort of a perfect place for me to talk about the taxonomy that I put together for one of my prime examples. It's Pizzagate. If you don't know what Pizzagate is, one, you're very lucky. Two, I'm sorry, I'm about to spoil that for you. So in the Podesta email dump that WikiLeaks put out, there's a weird email between people, including Democratic operative John Podesta and Marina Abramovich, like an artist, and there's just like, and then there's like a pizzeria also involved, and it makes no sense. If this sort of logical connection doesn't make sense to you, like it's because it literally doesn't make sense. So they took this email and they just went, oh, actually, like we think this pizzeria is engaging in child trafficking, and these emails are coded messages for trading trafficked children among Democrats. And this sort of Pizzagate conspiracy got really popular online. It was pushed by a lot of alt-right personalities. There were a lot of like news stories spun up about it. And then it actually culminated in a gunman showing up to the pizzeria and shooting his rifle in the air. And there is no child sex trafficking conspiracy. I think the famous quote from the gunman is, I may not have had, like the facts might not have all been like on the level or something like that, is like something like that. And it's like, the interesting thing about Pizzagate to me is it's this perfect confluence of three things. One is, oh my God, Russians. Because the Podesta email hack can be attributed to a hacker who is very determined not to be identified as Russian. And yet a lot of factors would indicate that he is. And the second piece is 4chan assholes. Like, there is a deep culture of toxicity online that is brewed up sort of into the heart of the new fascism. And that was a big part of spreading this weird theory, which wasn't really like necessarily attached to the email dump. It was spun up out of the email dump. And then the third part is clickbait profiteers. Like, there was a real financial incentive in generating this outrage around this improbable story and around spreading it and getting people to believe in it. And it's the confluence of those three factors. We can identify specific actors who are kind of, they straddle the like two of those factors. For instance, I'd say Breitbart is part of sort of a toxic online culture and a clickbait profiteering. But I think the commonality here, other than horrible hate mongering, is actually that the very core of Pizzagate, there's a fact. That email dump is real. Those emails are real. There's something true at the very heart of it. And it's the same with this OkCupid thing, is that the OkCupid data was real. The stuff that's spun up on top is not. But at the core of it, there is a truth to it. And so you have to wonder, what has gone wrong such that if you've got a truth at the very bottom, why is it that you're getting this elaborate artifice of things that are misleading, things that are outright false, things that are just extremely damaging to the fabric of society? What has happened to sort of our information ecosystem such that that kind of thing is being amplified?
Yeah, I think, well, there's two things. One, I just want to add to the conspiracy, especially now that we're streaming and all that. There is actually a photograph of me at Comet Ping Pong, which is the pizzeria in Northeast DC where this happened. I was actually there eating in early 2016. So now that I am this anti-alt-right personality, I'm sure that will get that Pizzagate re-spinning. But I think it's really about confirmation bias. It's that we've figured out how to weaponize people's confirmation bias, that it doesn't matter whether a story is true. It matters if it is something that they want to hear, and if there's enough to it that allows them to latch on to something, just one thing that they can hook onto that makes them, say, oh yes, this is, I want to believe that the Democrats are evil people. So, here's this one little fact, and now I have established this whole new fiction or whatever around it, but there is that fact. And so because that fact is undeniable, I can now create this framework around it that makes whatever I already believe justifiable.
And there's this halo effect around data dumps in particular, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a halo effect around the Podesta email dump. So even if you're taking one email out of context and spinning up something stupid around it, suddenly it's oh, but it came from WikiLeaks. It's this email dump. It's real. And same thing with the OkCupid thing. Even if you're not applying the scientific method correctly, it's oh, but that is real. There is this big dump of stuff, and it's all real.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this is not even something that's abstract. We talk about fake news. We can have all these panels and stuff about it, but it actually is something that manifests and has manifest in very real dangerous ways. And one of the examples being this gunman who brings this AR into a pizza shop. And if you ever walk into this pizza restaurant, you're where would they even possibly do this? It's you can barely find a table, let alone run a child trafficking ring out of it. But he walks in there with an AR and shoots up the place. And thankfully he didn't shoot anybody. And I just don't understand why he didn't just say, oh, well, that's obviously nonsense, and then turn around and walk out. But that's a very real consequence. And what we saw in Charlottesville was also a very real consequence, because when we got surrounded by the Nazis at the statue, they were actually citing statistics at me about queer people and about trans people. And these were statistics that are really common to find online, but they're also completely misleading. They've been you take a kernel of something that is real and then you morph it and you twist it until it meets what you want to believe. And so one of the things that somebody, literally a Nazi wearing a swastika, screamed in my face at the statue while carrying a torch was, you're trans, you have a 41% chance of committing suicide. And that's not true. It's not actually borne out in any statistics whatsoever. But it has been this a result of a study that looked at suicidal ideation in transgender teens in Britain. And it was something that, it was a survey from people who said, have you ever been at this point? Like, have you ever been so depressed that you're thinking about suicide? And 41% of people said yes. And that's a horrible thing. That is something that needs more attention, but it has morphed into, like, if you're trans, you're going to have a 41% chance of killing yourself. And then they use that to justify their bigotry and then, like, beat us up with torches. So it is something that is, like, a very real, like, it very quickly becomes a very real threat.
I think it's like interesting because, and I'm sure this has been said a million times in these panels, it's like confirmation bias isn't new. Confirmation bias existed before the internet. Tabloidism, rumor, misinformation, propaganda, lies, they all existed way before we had computers. But it's just like everything, the scale, we've never seen this before. We've never seen the speed before. We thought that, like Moore's law and sort of the increase in processing speeds was going to make everything better, but then it turns out some things just shouldn't get faster, some things shouldn't get better, and that's just us, like it's catching up with us now.
Yeah. So let's talk about Russia a little bit.
Yeah.
Richard Spencer actually came back to Charlottesville with torches just a few weeks ago on October 7th. And one of the things that he marched through our downtown area and chanted, his group of people chanted, "Russia is our friend." And it was like a really pathetic chant. It was like really awkward. If you watch a video, they're like really not into it. And they're just like, I'm just here for the Nazi stuff. I don't know what we're talking about. But what is it about Russia, like specifically?
So for one thing, I like suspect a lot of the Russia narrative is being spun up because people want to believe someone's in control, right? And like, to be clear, there are specific incidents that can be traced to foreign interference, but let's run through some of them. So we've got like the Atlantic Council, which, they did an okay job, but it's like the funding source, I think, is kind of like people should keep that in mind when looking at sort of the studies that they put out. They found basically like a botnet pushing pro-Kremlin lines on Twitter. And this is super worrisome, right? It's hundreds of thousands of accounts. Like this is like, you can trace the messaging to RT and to Sputnik. But if you look at the messaging, they're comparing Antifa and Black Lives Matter to Ukrainian neo-Nazis, I think. And it's like, well, I don't think that messaging really got much purchase in the US, actually. I don't think this fake news campaign worked out too well for some reason. And then you've got another news story that's like, oh, Russians used Facebook events to organize anti-immigrant rallies on US soil. One, true. Two, buried deep in the article, like 5 paragraphs down, it mentions, 48 people RSVP'd and 4 people showed up. And it's just like, so this sort of cause and effect, it's like really hard to match up cause and effect in the real world. And another example, I think this is the most recent one, and the Senate is looking into it. Russian operatives, like through cutouts, appear to have bought, I think it's like something on the order of like tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of ads on Facebook, basically pushing racial divisions in the US. And one, it's like Facebook, of course, says, well, it's a very tiny fraction of all the ads that are bought. And it's like, yeah, but they also targeted specific people. They targeted a very specific demographic to push these ads onto. But if you look at sort of the core of that story, you kind of get this funny sensation because the way that they exploited racial tensions in America was to draw attention to police brutality, like real police brutality, like the death of Freddie Gray. And at that point, you're just like, well, one, yes, these are Russian trolls, but two, the Russian trolls have a point, actually. And so one of the things that you're getting at is not so much that the heart of all of this is Russia, but rather that these incidents of foreign interference appear to be riding on top of a larger infrastructure that when you take another look at it, it's propagating misinformation from other sources as well. So one of the things that my slide deck, which I will not be showing you guys, runs through is like incidents in which like the New York Times or NPR chase down people who actually just write up literal fake stories on the internet, like things that are like don't even have a kernel of truth to them, like things that are like, Hillary Clinton murders 52 people, or like tens of thousands of pre-written ballots have been found in a warehouse in Ohio, right? These stories, when you chase down the people who wrote them, it's just some dude in a basement who's like, oh yeah, I'm making like $100,000 a month off of this stuff. People who run sites like politicsusa.com or like the Denver Guardian. There is no Denver Guardian. It's just a dude. And these people make quite a lot of money, and when you ask them, it's because of Facebook. It's because of Facebook clicks, essentially. Like when you win the Facebook lottery, you cash out. And Google Ads is to an extent also complicit, but one of the things that, like another consistent theme in sort of these case studies was that they're like, oh yeah, once Google figured out what we were doing, we got delisted. And then we lost out, and then we had to go and find ad networks on our own. But the Facebook thread was consistent through all of this. And so why wouldn't Russia use Facebook, right? It's not that misinformation is starting with Russia. It's that Russia sees an opportunity to use a technology that is completely designed around, like its profit motive, its sort of raison d'etre, is to sell bullshit to people that they didn't want in the first place. And so, of course, you'd ride on top of that infrastructure to sell people bullshit they didn't want in the first place.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's, in looking at what Facebook has done and how they've managed to optimize this process, they've actually done psychological research studies. And last year, they released an internally generated ethics report, of course exonerating themselves, because why wouldn't you? But in it, they go through extreme lengths to justify why they don't need to have an IRB, to do like straight up psychological manipulation research, which they did. And so,
does everyone remember the sentiment analysis thing that they did? Do you want to run through that real quick?
Yeah. So briefly, like they had this experiment where they would like take posts and they would selectively show you posts where like your friends were miserable, or if they were happy, and see how that affected what you would post, and do sentiment analysis on that. And they actually found that like by modulating what they present to you, what content they present to you, they can actually affect your emotions. And they admit that they can affect voter turnout. And then in the same breath, they say, but we had nothing to do with the results of the 2016 election. And so they released this ethics report. And there has been quite a bit of effort in corporate spaces to justify why we don't need to use IRBs and the frameworks of academic and medical research to do what we would do in a corporate environment, which might be like A/B testing, stuff like that. But what they actually ignore is that the elements of informed consent they are not exempted. And so I actually haven't gone back and looked at their terms of service for this period of time, but there is a real question as to whether any of us actually consented to be party to this research at any point. And so it's a really interesting angle that like Facebook has used all of us as research subjects, probably against our consent, to build this platform that has basically streamlined interference in some degree with our news cycle.
Manipulation.
Yeah.
I was telling Emily last night, actually, the extent to which Facebook controls the journalism industry. And this is something you may be more aware of now, but like just a year ago, people didn't realize this outside of journalism. Facebook drives a lot of traffic. It can like basically make or break digital journalism, like digital media outfits basically live or die on the algorithm. Do you guys remember like a couple years ago when Upworthy links were all over Facebook and it was really annoying? Well, Facebook engineers also found it annoying and they tweaked the algorithm. Upworthy links no longer seem to dominate the Facebook algorithm. Like they were suppressed and upwardly contracted. Like they're not the media property that they used to be. They used to be much more valuable as a media property, and then the algorithm changed and they aren't anymore. This sort of pattern is actually continuing. There is, first of all, there's like a famous pivot to video going on right now, where Facebook changed its algorithm to privilege video over written news articles. So there's mass layoffs at a lot of these companies right now, and just sort of a lot of panic in the air because the companies are basically reshaping themselves to fit the Facebook algorithm. And then there's, the really disturbing thing I was telling you last night was there's this thing where Facebook will punish you essentially for having a viral story, like your other stories will be suppressed. Because they kind of want more diversity in the newsfeed. So what ends up happening is that if you have 2 really important stories that week, good luck to one of them, because one of them is going to go up and the other one is kind of like, it's not going to appear as much. And like it's really troubling because of how much power Facebook has. Like if it were just any other platform, like who cares? Like it'll be over soon. Like the money will dry up. But it's, everyone talks about like, oh, well, it'll be like MySpace. No, it's been like 10 years.
Yeah, MySpace only lasted like 3 years. Tops.
Yeah, there's like people growing up now who have like not known a time before, like people who are almost fully formed human beings who do not remember a time before Facebook. So like I think it's time we set aside that argument.
Yeah. So there's been, and we talked about this a little bit, like there's been some discussions even here about like, should Facebook be nationalized? Like should Google be nationalized? And I think that there's like some people that really see that Facebook is a critical component of our internet infrastructure and our social infrastructure. And because it is so important, because Google is so important, like we can't live without Google. Like, I don't know what we would do. Right? That it is so important that maybe the government should take it over, but also like which government?
Yeah, I think we're in agreement with this one where it's like, I mean, I think sort of that feeling in the air is right. Like it's just gone too far, right? Like something has to be done, but no one knows what that something is. And I mean, do you really want the United States federal government to interfere with Facebook right now? Like what world are you living on? Whatever it is, it's better than my world. And then there's just sort of the issue of like, do you really for instance, do you want the government of Pakistan to nationalize Facebook? Does that sound good to you? I think it's just super complicated. Like we live kind of in this new world where we're just beginning to get a sense of what has gone wrong and we don't have any solutions for it yet.
Yeah, and I think, I guess we're gonna kind of want to shift this around because one of the challenges with dealing with the Facebooks and the Googles and all of these companies that control our information is that there's people, who work there, right? And we can no longer assume that the people that work there have the best intentions, even though some of us might work at these companies or know people who do, and I'm sure we're all lovely people. But then there are people like our friend James Damore. And so this was going to be something I was going to talk about, where he used fake science, where he cited, if you don't know who James Damore is, he was the Google Manifest bro.
There's going to be someone in this audience who before the session didn't know what Pizzagate or James Damore was, and they're going to leave very unhappy.
Yeah, and I'm really sorry. And if that's you, let me know, and I'll make reparations. James Damore was a Google engineer who wrote a memo that said that the emphasis on diversity was too strong, that the value of empathy was too strong, and that we should really just focus on hiring more white men because they get things done. And he cited a bunch of science in quotes, and decontextualized it and wrote it in very academic language, which was enough to fool people that weren't critical. But if you're like a professional working in these spaces, you read this memo and you're like, this is garbage.
Yeah, thinly veiled white supremacist propaganda.
Yeah, very sexist, very racist. Nonsense. And so the challenge is that when we look at how do we fix Facebook, we have to realize that a significant portion of their engineers share these beliefs. Like, a significant portion of Twitter engineers and like people who do anti-harassment at Twitter share these beliefs. So how do we like even begin to approach that problem?
And it is like, for me, it does seem like a problem that's far too big. But once we start to see it actually as an issue of like institutions that need to be tackled, I think this is kind of a hopeful message, right? Like, it's either that we're looking at sort of the state of the world, like sort of engulfed in fascist flames, right? And either that's because of an inherent darkness of the human heart that we cannot really control, or it's because something has gone really awry with our institutions and we need to change them. We need to change them from the bottom up. And yes, it's very hard to even think about challenging, institutionalized racism and sexism in the technology industry. It's very hard to think about living in a world where Facebook is not Facebook. And yet, isn't that, like, it's a little more of a cheerful prospect than living in a world where the majority of people are actually just very evil people. Like, I think I mean, you wouldn't be here at MozFest if you didn't believe in fighting for hopeless causes.
Very legit. Cheers to that.
Right, I'm just going to check whether does anybody have any questions? I thought there would be one. The centre here.
Hi, thank you so much. I have 20 questions, but I will only ask 3, and feel free to just answer one. So my first question is to Sarah. The focus is a lot on foreign interference of like foreign to the US.
Yes.
Whereas if
I
you look
apologize for that.
No, not at all. But if you look at, like, let's say the Snowden documents, there are also evidence that Western intelligence agencies also engage in
Absolutely.
computerized propaganda. And just wanted to know if you have more sort of like example stories, or whether you think there's a debate on this.
So I was actually just talking to someone the other day who told me that NATO engaged in sort of systematic like ad buyout in Afghanistan during the war to basically spread NATO propaganda. So yeah, the newly released JFK files. There's a line in there about having something like 60 journalists on the dole for the CIA. It is definitely what is happening to the United States now is karma. But it doesn't mean that the people who are suffering deserve it. Like, it doesn't mean any of this is good. But yes, one of the reasons why all of this is so much worse than it could be is because the powers that be have engaged in these tactics for a very long time and have become very good at it. And those methods have been out there for a really long time. And the powers that be have not seen fit to suppress the channels by which they've engaged in that. But sorry, did you have another question? Okay.
No? Yeah,
Yes.
okay, there
Yes.
we go, perfect. Yeah, I have a question for both of you. It's kind of like maybe tuned a little differently for each. I've been grappling with this quite a bit. So on the science side, I wonder if part of the challenge is that as the science is getting out into the world, journalists have this motivation to get it out quickly and don't have the knowledge that you described to kind of interpret whether something is correlation or causation or what have you. So I wonder if you've found anything around the model that can be fixed that's going to help. And I think for Sarah, I was on the tube on the way over here, and I saw this ad from Russia Today that says, the CIA calls us propagandists, you should check us out to see what we call the CIA. In both of these cases, I'm like, there's something at work here, which is like an economic model that's empowering all of this to happen. So in what way can Mozillians fight back against that?
Yeah, so what's really interesting about the fake science side is that there's a model that exists and has existed for quite some time. And it is really the open data and open science movement. In the case of the OkCupid story, what we saw was that open data and open science platforms were used to try to push a narrative, and it ultimately failed because we were able to very quickly do a peer review and critique his work, and not only critique his work, but also kind of shut down all of his future work And so to the point where, like, if you search Emil Kierkegaard, it comes up that he is basically a fraud and he got kicked out of school and all of that. So this model actually exists. And preprint services have existed in the field of math and physics for quite some time. And if you're in math and physics, like every week somebody posts to like a Usenet or whatever, like I've proved the Riemann hypothesis. Like I'm pretty sure the second Usenet post ever made was like I've proved the Riemann hypothesis. And we don't actually see this being reported on with regularity because it's very quick for people to shut that down. So if we can just get to the point where we use open platforms for peer review and also break down the barriers to existing scientific research by like upending the publishers, then we'll get to that point. So yeah, we can combat that, but it does take effort, and we have to understand that the scientific process is not just researching, analyzing, writing, but also reviewing, critiquing, and revisiting.
I also think that journalists should be more responsible, honestly. But I know that's like easy to say, but as a journalist, I'm like, journalists should be more responsible. Kind of a hilarious anecdote from the James Damore week, in which our science team was full of just flames on the side of their face. One of our science reporters started to reach out, and she just really didn't want to do this. She's like, do I really have to? Look at the journals he's citing. Like one is like, it's a random Estonian one. Like I don't really, like why do I have to do this? Good science reporters are aware of the journal issue, and they're aware of peer review and all that. But yeah, she reached out to, I think, like a neurobiologist or something for comment on the Damore memo. And this was like the first man that she reached out to, and he goes, haven't read it, about to go on vacation, but as far as I can tell, the science seems sound. Scientists could probably do better too, is I guess what I'm saying.
Scientists, we definitely need to do better.
What was my side of the question again?
Something about the CIA and advertising.
Oh, so, what can Mozillians do? Like bringing sort of like the power back to the people kind of element of that is like really, really important. Whatever's going on right now with sort of the entire web being weaponized against people for profit, like that's something that Mozillians have been railing against for like a decade at this point. It's like, oh, ads are bad, tracking is bad, like the privacy concerns are terrible, and they just never quite resonated with people. And I think like truly casting a light on what the advertising system is doing to us and to democracy and to like ideas and our ability to be people with each other, I think that's a big part. Is when people start to understand that, like we might actually have like a real consumer revolt on our hands.
Final question over here.
Corporations are really getting into this sort of public game, right? Apple wants to build town halls and city squares, and Facebook wants to bring people together, and Google wants to organize the world's information. And you get these big corporations who are now doing things that maybe should be separate from the corporate sphere, like, oh, we're a research institution. It's like, well, no, you're a shareholder-owned profit-making enterprise. How do we start to request a firewall between these sorts of endeavors, again, between the governmental or non-governmental organization work of research and infrastructure, and I'm asking like to the easy answer of how do we unprivatize all this stuff, but do you see any avenues by which we could begin to push back against this sort of corporate pervasion into our lives?
Do you want to start with this one? I think I have to form my thoughts on that.
I don't have an answer that I'm ready to give on camera.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I think there's a common thread that I've been preaching throughout many of these debates, and that is that we are entering an era where we need to get back to real physical space, community defense, community involvement. And that means that we need to make the conscious choice to exclude these powers from our life. And that means not just the Facebooks, but also the government. And I'm putting on my anarchist hat at the moment. But one of the ways that we can do that is to reject the idea of the state and the state's actors. And we need to treat Facebook and Google, even though they're private companies, we know that they're in concert with the state. And so building up capacity in our communities for how to deal with things that doesn't involve, like, for example, calling the police, is a way that we can push back against that. And I'm seeing this thread all throughout the country. I'm seeing this thread throughout the world, really, of how do we build community involvement to take care of each other. The chant is, who keeps us safe? We keep us safe.
Sarah, Emily, thank you.